It's been 3 months since I clawed my way out of that hellhole, and I still wake up screaming every night. The nightmares never stop, vivid flashes of what happened down there in the darkness. The faces of those I left behind haunt me, their expressions frozen in terror or worse, in that uncanny serenity that came after the change took them. I've relocated 6 times since my escape, always paying in cash, always using different names, but I know they're tracking me. Sometimes I spot them, ordinary looking men and women whose eyes follow me too intently, whose movements seem just slightly off rhythm with the rest of humanity. But I need to document what occurred before it's too late. People need to know the truth. This record might be my last contribution to humanity, a warning of what's coming for us all. My name is Dr. James Vega. I'm, or rather was, a civilian scientist specializing in experimental biology with a focus on cellular regeneration. My research centered on accelerating tissue repair in trauma patients, work that had garnered some attention in academic circles, but nothing that would explain why 2 men in pristine black suits appeared at my laboratory one Thursday afternoon in late October. I remember the exact moment they entered. I was pipetting samples for my latest experiment, my back to the door, when the air pressure in the room subtly changed. I turned to find them standing just inside the doorway, unnaturally still, their identical dark suits without a single wrinkle despite the autumn rainstorm raging outside. Dr. Vega, the taller one, said, not bothering with introductions. Your country needs your expertise on a matter of national security. I almost laughed. It sounded like dialogue from a bad spy movie, but their credentials when presented were legitimate. Department of Defense, Advanced Research Division, with authorization signatures I recognized from published Pentagon reports. The taller man, who never gave his name, explained that my work on cellular regeneration had implications for a classified project. The offer they presented was too intriguing to refuse. Unlimited funding, cutting-edge equipment, and the chance to work with biological samples allegedly demonstrating unprecedented regenerative capabilities. This could advance your research by decades, the shorter man said, his first and only contribution to the conversation, and save countless lives. What did I have to lose? My divorce had finalized 6 months prior after years of growing apart. Caroling claiming my work had become an obsession, that I'd forgotten how to connect with actual living people instead of cells in Petri dishes. She wasn't entirely wrong. We had no children. My parents were long deceased, victims of a highway pileup when I was in graduate school. My sister hadn't spoken to me in years, not since I missed her wedding while pursuing a research breakthrough. I was the perfect candidate. Brilliant enough to be useful, isolated enough to disappear without anyone asking questions. How long would this assignment last? I asked, already knowing I would accept. Approximately 3 months, the taller man replied. All your current projects will be placed on hold with full funding maintained. As far as your colleagues will know, you're taking a sabbatical to consult on a private medical initiative. Within 24 hours, I had signed more non-disclosure agreements than I knew existed. They confiscated my phone, laptop, and all personal electronics. I was permitted 1 suitcase of clothing and personal items, all of which were thoroughly searched. The journey began in a black SUV with tinted windows, followed by a military transport plane where I was the only passenger not in uniform. The final leg was by helicopter, and it was then they blindfolded me, claiming the location's coordinates were classified. I could tell we were heading north, the air growing progressively colder during the long flight. The helicopter's movements suggested a mountainous region, frequent altitude adjustments, banking around what must have been peaks and valleys. When we finally landed, and they removed my blindfold, I stood before an unremarkable concrete structure nestled between pine-covered mountains. The building resembled a small communications outpost, or weather monitoring station, a simple rectangle of weathered concrete with a few small windows, and a single steel door. "This is just the entrance," explained my escort as he placed his palm on a hidden scanner. A green light flashed, and a section of the wall slid away, revealing an elevator that looked strikingly modern compared to the dated exterior. The facility is approximately 1,000 feet below us. The descent took nearly 2 minutes. My ears popped painfully as the elevator plunged deeper than any civilian structure had the right to go. The walls were solid steel, unmarked except for a digital display showing our depth increasing at an alarming rate. I felt a momentary claustrophobic panic, the realization that soon nearly a quarter mile of Earth would separate me from the surface. When the doors finally opened, I found myself in a reception area that looked like it belonged in a modern corporate office, not a subterranean government black site. Polished floors, recessed lighting, and sleek furniture created an atmosphere of professional sterility. Armed guards stood at attention near another set of security doors, their expressions impassive but their eyes watchful. Commander Gregory Wilson met me there, a square-jawed military man with salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp and the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades in service. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced but never reaching his eyes, which remained calculating and cold. "Welcome to Deep Shield, Dr. Vega. You're the final addition to our research team," he said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a career officer. "I trust your journey was comfortable enough." Without waiting for my response, he swiped a keycard at the security doors and gestured me through. "We maintain strict compartmentalization here. Your keycard will be programmed with appropriate access levels once processing is complete." He led me through a maze of corridors into a large conference room where 11 people sat waiting. My new colleagues. Some wore lab coats like mine, others military uniforms, and a few dressed in nondescript tactical gear that screamed security personnel. All eyes turned to me as I entered, some curious, others wary, a few openly hostile. "Allow me to make introductions," Wilson said, gesturing around the table. "Dr. Elena Rodriguez, our lead scientist. Dr. Michael Thomas, our resident psychologist. Chief of Security Frank Reynolds." Dr. Rodriguez was a striking woman in her mid-40s, with intense dark eyes and a reputation in cellular biology that even I envied. She gave me a curt nod but no smile. Dr. Thomas, by contrast, appeared almost inappropriately friendly, a round-faced man with thinning hair and an eager handshake. Reynolds was exactly what I'd expect from a security chief, tall, muscular, with vigilant eyes that seemed to catalog my every movement. Wilson continued around the table, naming researchers, technicians, and military personnel. Dr. William Jenkins, acoustic specialist. Dr. Eliza Walker, biochemist. Dr. Amir Kumar, geneticist. Lab technicians Marcus Thompson and Lisa Donovan. Security officers Garcia and Mitchell. Medical officer Captain Patel. "This will be your entire world for the next 3 months," Wilson concluded. "I suggest you get comfortable with one another." Dr. Rodriguez gave me a brief tour of the facility afterward. The complex was much larger than I had anticipated, 6 levels connected by both elevators and emergency stairwells. The upper levels contained living quarters, a surprisingly well-appointed cafeteria, recreation rooms with gym equipment and entertainment options, and administrative offices. The middle levels housed the laboratories, medical facilities, and storage areas for both supplies and specimens. "What about the lowest level?" I asked, noticing it on the facility map displayed on a wall but seeing it marked simply as a restricted zone. "Classified," Rodriguez replied curtly. "Even I don't have clearance." She paused, then added with a hint of bitterness, "Military keeps their secrets, even from the scientists doing their work." My quarters were on level 2, a private room approximately 12 by 15 feet, containing a bed, desk, small bathroom, and storage space for my belongings. Though windowless, the room was surprisingly comfortable, with adjustable lighting designed to mimic natural daylight cycles and a ventilation system that kept the air fresh despite being so far underground. That night, alone in my room, I reviewed the preliminary briefing materials provided on a secure tablet. Our mission involved studying biological samples collected during an Arctic expedition 3 months earlier. The documents were frustratingly vague about the specimen's origins or discovery circumstances, but emphasized their unique regenerative properties and potential applications for advanced medical treatments and defense technology. Defense technology. The phrase stuck with me as I tried to sleep that first night. What kind of defensive applications could come from biological regeneration? Wound healing for soldiers was the obvious answer, but something about the heavily redacted sections of the brief suggested more sinister possibilities. The first week passed in a whirlwind of orientation sessions, security briefings, and getting acquainted with the laboratory equipment, much of which was more advanced than anything I'd worked with before. The facility operated in shifts around the clock, the absence of natural light making it easy to lose track of time. Only our tablets and the lighting systems in our quarters marked the passage of days. Commander Wilson established strict routines for everyone: work shifts, meal times, mandated recreation periods, and lights out at 11 p.m. Though we were all adults, most with advanced degrees, the regimented schedule felt infantilizing. When I mentioned this to Dr. Thomas during our mandated psychological baseline assessment, he smiled sympathetically. Structure helps prevent the psychological deterioration common in isolated environments, he explained. You'd be surprised how quickly humans can unravel without the ordinary markers of time and social obligation. His words would prove grimly prophetic in the weeks to come. On day 7, we finally got our first look at the specimens. The main laboratory on level 3 was a state-of-the-art facility centered around a specialized containment chamber, a glass enclosure with integrated robotic manipulation arms and atmospheric controls. Dr. Rodriguez carefully removed a sealed container from a biohazard storage unit, placing it within the chamber before opening it remotely. Inside was what appeared to be ordinary tissue, approximately the size of a tennis ball, pinkish gray and pulsating slightly as though still living despite being separated from whatever organism it had originated from. But as we conducted our initial tests, it became clear this was unlike anything in scientific literature. The cells demonstrated unprecedented regenerative capabilities, rapidly healing any damage we inflicted for testing purposes. A small sample placed in a nutrient solution doubled in mass overnight without any additional biological material. Most disturbing, the cells seemed to adapt to our testing methods, becoming more resistant to damage with each experiment, as though learning from the experience. During one analysis, as Dr. Jenkins was measuring electrical conductivity within the sample, the power fluctuated throughout the lab. Equipment shut down momentarily before humming back to life, computer screens flashing with static before resetting. Rodriguez looked concerned but dismissed it as growing pains in the facility's systems. Happened sometimes with the backup generators cycling, she said, though her expression suggested this wasn't the whole truth. The second week brought our first breakthrough. Dr. Jenkins discovered the specimens responded to specific sound frequencies, either contracting or expanding depending on the pitch. This reaction wasn't documented in the preliminary reports, suggesting the specimens were evolving or revealing new properties. It's almost like they're listening, Jenkins mused during a team meeting, responding to communication attempts. Let's not anthropomorphize cellular material, Commander Wilson said sharply. These are biological samples, not sentient beings. As our research intensified, tensions emerged between the scientific team and military personnel. Commander Wilson began implementing stricter protocols about specimen handling, limiting access to certain data, and monitoring our communications more closely. Twice, I caught him reviewing my research notes without permission, claiming it was standard security procedure. By the third week, something else began happening. Several team members, myself included, started experiencing vivid dreams of subterranean passages extending far below even our deep facility. In mine, I wandered endless tunnels that seemed to breathe and pulse around me, always drawn downward by something I couldn't see but desperately needed to find. The dreams left me exhausted, as though I'd physically traversed those miles of corridor. During a meal break, I overheard Dr. Walker describing an identical dream to Thompson, who went pale as she spoke. "I've been having the same dream for 4 nights," he whispered, right down to the pulsing walls and the voice calling from below. "What voice?" Walker asked, but Thompson clammed up when he noticed me listening. The first serious incident occurred on day 23. Lab technician Thompson was conducting routine measurements on a specimen when he suddenly collapsed, his body convulsing violently as foam spilled from his mouth. The specimen he'd been working with seemed to pulse more rapidly, its color intensifying as Thompson seized beside it. We rushed him to the medical bay where Dr. Thomas and Captain Patel stabilized him. The official diagnosis was a seizure of unknown origin. Blood tests revealed nothing unusual. Brain scans showed no abnormalities, and Thompson recovered physically within hours. But something had changed. His eyes seemed vacant, his normally talkative nature replaced by long silences and mumbled responses. Dr. Thomas attributed it to post-seizure confusion and ordered rest. But I noticed Thompson watching the walls with unusual intensity, as though seeing something the rest of us couldn't. That evening, attempting to email a personal research note to my secure tablet, I discovered our communications system had been disabled. The internal network functioned for facility operations, but no connection to the outside world was available. When I questioned Commander Wilson, he claimed it was temporary maintenance, but his explanation felt rehearsed. "Standard protocol during sensitive research phases," he assured me. "We'll restore external communications once we've contained any potential information leakage." Days later, Thompson returned to work, but he wasn't the same person. I caught him several times standing motionless in corners, staring at blank walls, his lips moving silently. Once, passing his quarters late at night, I heard him conversing with someone, though he was supposedly alone. "They're coming up from below," he whispered to the empty room. "Can't you hear them scratching at the foundation? They've been waiting so long." I reported this to Dr. Thomas, who added it to a growing list of stress-related behavioral anomalies among the team. The isolation was affecting everyone. Arguments erupted over minor issues in the lab. Paranoia crept into everyday interactions. Several researchers reported hearing strange noises in the ventilation system during night hours, scraping sounds that security dismissed as settling concrete or mechanical issues. On day 34, Dr. Kumar vanished. He failed to appear for his morning shift, and a search of his quarters showed his bed had not been slept in. Commander Wilson organized a facility-wide search, but Kumar had simply disappeared within a completely sealed underground bunker, an impossibility that no one could explain. Security footage showed Kumar entering his quarters the previous night but never leaving. Reynolds suggested a camera malfunction, but the unspoken question hung in the air. Where could he have gone in a facility with no exits accessible without security clearance? The atmosphere changed after Kumar's disappearance. People moved in pairs, eyes constantly darting to vents and shadows. Our research continued, but conversations became muted, as though we feared being overheard by something hiding in the walls. 3 days after Kumar's disappearance, Reynolds himself went missing. He had been investigating unauthorized access attempts to the restricted lowest level and ventured there alone against protocol. The search team found his security card and flashlight at the entrance to the restricted zone, but no other trace of him. He must have dropped these and continued inside, Commander Wilson concluded, leading a heavily armed team through the security door. They returned hours later, Wilson's face grim. No sign of him was all he reported, refusing to describe what they had found instead. By day 40, our specimens had begun exhibiting even more unusual properties. One morning, I arrived at the lab to find a specimen had somehow moved within its sealed container overnight, leaving a slime trail on the interior glass. When I reviewed the security footage, there was an unexplained 2-minute gap precisely when the movement must have occurred. The power outages worsened, sometimes plunging entire levels into darkness for minutes before the backup generators engaged. During one blackout, Dr. Walker claimed she felt something brush against her in the darkness, something that didn't feel human. "It was like being touched by wet leather," she whispered later, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee cup. "And it was warm." While helping Dr. Thomas search Thompson's quarters for clues to his increasingly erratic behavior, we discovered a journal hidden beneath his mattress. Its pages contained disturbing drawings of elongated figures emerging from walls and floors. Notes in increasingly chaotic handwriting referenced the things that live in the walls, and they watch us through the vents. The final pages contained a crude map of the facility with dozens of tunnels and passages that didn't exist on the official blueprints. Dr. Thomas conducted emergency psychological evaluations on all remaining personnel. Her conclusions were troubling. Multiple team members showed signs of extreme stress, paranoia, and possible shared delusion. She recommended immediate evacuation of the facility and termination of the research project. Commander Wilson refused. "No one is leaving until our work is complete," he stated during a tense meeting. "These are normal psychological responses to prolonged underground confinement. Dr. Thomas will implement appropriate therapeutic interventions." We were prisoners, I realized, lab rats in our own experiment. That night, I attempted to access the emergency protocols on my secure tablet, searching for evacuation procedures or communication overrides. Instead, I found heavily encrypted files that weren't supposed to be accessible to my clearance level. A system glitch during one of the power fluctuations had temporarily removed some security barriers. The documents I glimpsed before the system corrected itself contained references to previous research cycles and specimen adaptation patterns. Most disturbing was a casualty report listing 23 fatalities in an event simply called Containment Failure C. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. 2 military personnel disappeared while checking the supposedly malfunctioning backup generators. Their screams echoed through the facility's communication system before being abruptly cut off. The search team found only smears of blood leading to a ventilation shaft too small for a human to enter. Lab technician Donovan barricaded herself in her quarters after claiming she saw Thompson, who had again disappeared, crawling on the ceiling of the cafeteria like an insect. When security finally broke down her door, she was gone, the room empty except for hundreds of identical phrases written on the walls in what appeared to be blood. "They wear our skin." On day 53, after yet another disappearance, the remaining team members, now down to 8, demanded access to the restricted zone. Commander Wilson initially refused, but relented when faced with the possibility of a mutiny. Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Walker, Dr. Jenkins, the 2 remaining security officers Garcia and Mitchell, Commander Wilson, and myself descended to the lowest level. What we found there shattered any remaining illusions about our mission. The restricted zone contained another laboratory, abandoned and partially dismantled. Dust-covered equipment dated back decades, while faded nameplates on office doors revealed scientists who'd never been mentioned in any briefing. Personal items left behind suggested a hasty evacuation, or worse. Coffee cups still sat on desks, family photos remained pinned to bulletin boards, some showing yellowed with age. In a room marked primary containment, we discovered large, damaged tanks that must once have held specimens far larger than the samples we were studying. The glass was shattered outward, dried residue still coating the surrounding floor and walls. Most disturbing were the records we discovered on an ancient computer system Dr. Rodriguez managed to activate. Files dating back nearly 30 years detailed previous research teams, at least 2 before us, studying identical specimens in this same facility. Both teams had experienced similar phenomena: power fluctuations, missing personnel, psychological deterioration, and eventually specimen containment failures. The last log entry, dated nearly 20 years earlier, contained only 4 words: "They're in the walls." When confronted with this evidence, Commander Wilson finally revealed a partial truth. We were the 3rd research group. The previous teams had suffered psychological breakdowns resulting in project termination. "The specimens are too valuable to abandon," he explained, his voice eerily calm. "Each team makes progress before complications arise. Your team has advanced the research further than anyone before." "You knew," Dr. Walker accused, her voice shaking with rage. "You knew what happened to the others, and you brought us here anyway." "We had better containment protocols this time," Wilson replied, not denying the charge. "And the potential benefits outweigh the risks." "Benefits?" I asked. "What exactly are these specimens? Where did they come from?" Wilson hesitated, then sighed. "They were recovered from a meteor impact site in the Arctic. Initial analysis suggested extraterrestrial biological material, but that's been classified. What matters is their potential, regenerative capabilities beyond anything on Earth, possible applications for medicine, warfare, even space exploration." His revelation sparked immediate panic. Dr. Walker demanded we destroy all specimens and evacuate immediately. After heated debate, even Wilson agreed the situation had become untenable. We voted to terminate the experiment, incinerate the specimens, and contact the surface for emergency extraction. We returned to Level 3 and initiated emergency destruction protocols for the specimens. Dr. Jenkins prepared the incinerator while Dr. Rodriguez secured the samples for transport from their containment units. During the specimen destruction procedure, every containment unit in the main laboratory simultaneously failed. Doors opening, seals breaking, power shutting down to security measures. The emergency containment doors sealed automatically, trapping Dr. Jenkins and 2 technicians inside with the escaped specimens. The security feed showed only chaotic images, flashes of movement, terrified faces, then nothing as the cameras failed one by one. The facility's automated systems activated full quarantine protocol, sealing all levels and cutting off the already disabled communications with the surface. A computerized voice announced the lockdown would remain in effect for 30 days, the standard containment period for biological hazards. That night, we found Thompson dead in his quarters. His body was contorted into a position that should have been anatomically impossible, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Most disturbing were the wounds covering his body, not cuts or bruises but what appeared to be exit wounds, as though something had burst out from inside him. It was then I understood the horrifying truth. We were never meant to leave. We weren't researchers, we were part of the experiment. Whatever these specimens were, the government wasn't trying to study them, they were studying what the specimens did to us. The 7 remaining survivors barricaded ourselves in the cafeteria, the largest space with only 2 access points to defend. We took inventory of supplies, enough food and water for weeks, basic medical supplies, tools that could serve as weapons in an emergency. Dr. Rodriguez attempted to hack into the facility's main systems, hoping to override the quarantine protocol, but the computers had locked us out. "Someone on the surface is monitoring this," she said, staring at code scrolling across her tablet. "They're actively countering my attempts to break through." Dr. Walker collapsed into paranoia, accusing each of us in turn of being already infected or working for them. Her behavior became so erratic that Dr. Thomas was forced to sedate her, but not before she revealed something troubling, a small growth on her forearm that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "It appeared after I examined Thompson's body," she whispered before the sedative took effect. I think it's spreading inside me." On day 59, Dr. Rodriguez attempted to reach the communications room on level 2, believing she could bypass the quarantine protocols and send a distress signal. Despite our protests, she insisted on going alone. "If we all leave and something happens, there's no backup plan," she reasoned. "I'm the most qualified. If anyone can rewire the communications array, it's me." She never returned. Hours later, we spotted her on a security monitor moving strangely through a darkened corridor on level 4. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, her head tilted at an impossible angle. She wasn't alone. The transformed Thompson walked behind her, his body horrifically altered. His limbs had elongated, skin stretched tight over a frame that no longer seemed entirely human. Where his face had been was now a distorted version with too many eyes blinking independently of each other. When they passed directly beneath a camera, both looked up simultaneously as though sensing our observation. Thompson's new mouth split into a grotesque smile, and Rodriguez spoke directly to the camera. "Why are you hiding? We've made such wonderful discoveries. Come see what we're becoming." After that, we spotted other transformed personnel moving through the facility, Dr. Kumar dragging one leg behind him as he prowled the corridors, Reynolds with what appeared to be tentacles emerging from his shoulder blades, others too mutated to identify. They seemed to be searching for us, methodically checking rooms and occasionally stopping to press their ears against walls and ventilation ducts. Days blurred together after that. We slept in shifts, rationed food, and watched in horror as more of the facility transformed around us. Strange growths appeared on walls and abandoned sections, pulsating with an internal light. The very architecture began to change. Corridors that had been straight now curved in disorienting ways. Rooms that had once been rectangular developed odd angles and recesses. Dr. Thomas attempted to study the transformation using samples collected from the affected areas, but his equipment malfunctioned whenever he tried to analyze them. He did confirm one terrible truth, however: the changes weren't merely cosmetic. The facility itself was becoming organic, walls developing tissue-like properties, floors softening into something resembling cartilage in places. Security Officer Garcia began experiencing nightmares so vivid they left physical marks, bruises and scratches appearing on his body while he slept. During his final watch, he suddenly stood up, eyes wide, and whispered, "I can hear them in my head now. They're telling me to open the doors." Mitchell tackled him before he could reach the cafeteria entrance, but during the struggle, something beneath Garcia's skin began moving independently, pushing outward against his flesh in rippling patterns. Dr. Thomas administered emergency sedatives, but by morning, Garcia was gone, his restraints intact but empty, as though he had simply melted through them. By day 76, only 5 of us remained: myself, Commander Wilson, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Walker, who had recovered from her sedation but remained unstable, and Security Officer Mitchell. Our supplies dwindling, we made a desperate plan to reach the surface using maintenance shafts that bypassed the main corridors. The facility blueprints showed an emergency evacuation route designed for precisely the kind of containment failure we were experiencing. The route followed maintenance shafts through all 6 levels, eventually leading to an emergency hatch near the surface entrance, a last resort escape path requiring manual override of multiple security systems. We gathered what supplies we could carry: food, water, flashlights, medical kits, and improvised weapons. Commander Wilson distributed the only real firearms: his own sidearm and a shotgun from the security office. Our plan was to move quickly, avoid confrontation when possible, and reach the surface before the facility completely transformed around us. The journey was nightmarish from the beginning. The maintenance shafts, once simple metal tunnels, had become partially organic, the walls slick with an unidentifiable substance that seemed to react to our touch. In places, the metal had been completely absorbed, replaced by fibrous tissue that pulsed with an internal rhythm. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, voices that might have once been human whispering from branching passages, the squelch of movement in the walls around us, and occasionally a low hum that made our teeth vibrate and our thoughts scatter. We lost Dr. Walker first. As we navigated a particularly narrow section of shaft between levels 5 and 4, she suddenly began screaming that something was inside her chest. Before we could restrain her, she tore open her own shirt, revealing a horrific sight, her ribcage moving independently, bones shifting beneath the skin as though rearranging themselves. She bolted down a side passage before Mitchell could grab her, her screams echoing until they transformed into something no human throat should produce. We pushed onward, forcing ourselves not to look back. The route took us through sections of the facility I'd never seen, storage areas filled with equipment for experiments we hadn't been told about, living quarters for personnel who hadn't been introduced to us, and most disturbing, a room filled with preserved specimens in large tanks, some appearing partially human. We lost Mitchell next. Something reached out from a ventilation grill and dragged him screaming into darkness before we could react. His flashlight skittered across the floor, its beam illuminating a mass of writhing tendrils pulling him into a space too small for his body to fit. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was folded and compressed until he disappeared entirely, his screams cutting off with a wet, crunching sound. On the third day of our ascent, as we navigated through what had once been the facility's primary air circulation system on level 2, we encountered Dr. Rodriguez again, or what had once been Rodriguez. She moved like a marionette with half its strings cut, her skin stretched and pallid, eyes clouded white. Behind her stood others, transformed facility personnel now serving as vessels for whatever intelligence had been hiding within our specimens. "The metamorphosis is beautiful," she said, her voice overlaid with other voices speaking slightly out of sync. "Why resist evolution? We've transcended individual consciousness. Join us willingly and the transition will be painless." As they advanced toward us, I noticed how their bodies seemed to flow and connect with the altered facility around them, fingers extending into tendrils that merged with the walls, feet sinking into the floor as though rooting themselves to the structure. They weren't separate entities anymore, but extensions of a larger organism that had consumed the entire facility. Commander Wilson, who had been silently grappling with his role in bringing us all here, made his final act one of redemption. He handed me his keycard, the master access that would open the final emergency hatch. "I knew more than I told you," he confessed quickly. "This isn't the first facility. There are others. If you make it out, find Dr. Abernathy at Stillwater Research. Tell him Protocol Omega has failed." Then he ordered Dr. Thomas and me to run while he held them off with our last improvised flamethrower, a makeshift device using pressurized cooking fuel from the cafeteria. The last I saw of him, he was surrounded by former colleagues, their bodies twisting around him like a grotesque dance. Dr. Thomas and I reached the emergency evacuation shaft on day 86, a narrow tube leading to a hatch designed for last resort escape. The shaft was barely wide enough for one person, requiring us to climb straight up using metal rungs embedded in the concrete. But the concrete, like everything else, had begun to transform. The surface beneath our hands warm and yielding like skin, the rungs partially absorbed into the living tissue. As we prepared the explosive charges to break the sealed exit, standard demolition equipment stored in emergency caches throughout the facility, something massive began moving through the walls around us. The concrete itself seemed to bubble and shift as though it had become liquid. From this semi-solid mass emerged a figure I can only describe as a nightmare-given form, a culmination of all the transformed personnel fused into one entity that filled the chamber. At its center, I could distinguish faces I recognized. Thompson, Rodriguez, Kumar, even Wilson, their features still recognizable but woven into this abomination like specimens in amber. When it spoke, it used their voices in unison. "You've served your purpose well, Dr. Vega. The data collected from your group has been most illuminating. But the experiment isn't complete." Tendrils extended from the mass, reaching for us. Dr. Thomas fired the last of our shotgun rounds into the writhing flesh, causing it to recoil momentarily. "What are you?" I demanded, buying time as I finished setting the charges. "We're the next step," it replied, using Dr. Thomas's voice now though he stood beside me. "Humanity is inefficient, individual minds and individual bodies, disconnected, alone. We offer unity, perfect communication, perfect understanding." I realized then that it wasn't just studying us, it was learning from us, adapting to us, preparing for something larger. This facility wasn't containing it, it was incubating it. "How many facilities?" I asked. "How many teams before us?" The mass rippled, almost like laughter. "Many, across decades, each teaching us more about you, each bringing us closer to perfection." In the chaos that followed, Dr. Thomas became separated from me, tendrils wrapping around his legs as he screamed for me to trigger the charges. I detonated them prematurely, blowing the hatch, but causing a partial collapse of the shaft. As debris rained down, I scrambled upward through the damaged tube, Dr. Thomas's screams echoing as the entity below absorbed him. The last thing I heard was his voice, already changing, calling after me. "You can't escape what's already inside you, James." Day 87. I emerged into blinding daylight, my eyes burning after months underground. The hatch had opened onto a remote mountainside, miles from any civilization. The concrete entrance building was visible below, unchanged and innocent looking despite the horror it contained. No alarm sounded, no pursuit emerged. The entity had let me go, and that terrified me more than anything else. Disoriented and traumatized, I wandered through wilderness until a hiking group found me 3 days later, half dead from exposure and dehydration. I babbled my story to them, to the park rangers who airlifted me to safety, to the doctors who treated me, to anyone who would listen. Nobody believed me. The authorities claimed I was part of a geological research team that suffered carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty equipment in a remote outpost. They showed me falsified documentation of my assignment, staged photographs of colleagues who never existed. When I insisted on telling the truth, doctors diagnosed me with traumatic delirium and pumped me full of antipsychotics. Men in suits visited me in the hospital, different from the ones who had recruited me, but with the same flat effect and perfect clothing. They explained that I had experienced a psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. They showed me news articles about the tragic accident at the research station. They even brought a woman who claimed to be my emergency contact, though I'd never seen her before. All evidence of my actual experience had been scrubbed away, my apartment cleared out, research records altered, even my employment history mysteriously changed in official databases. According to all documentation, I had never been Dr. James Vega, cellular biology researcher, but rather James Vega, geologist with a history of psychiatric issues. I played along, feigning acceptance of their fabricated reality until they released me from the psychiatric facility where I'd been held for observation. Then I disappeared, using cash and false identification to stay off the grid, moving constantly to avoid detection. But I know the truth, and I know it isn't over. 3 weeks after my escape, I discovered a small growth on my lower back, a raised patch of skin that pulses occasionally in rhythm with my heartbeat. It's spreading slowly, the affected area now the size of my palm, and sometimes I swear I can hear whispers coming from it when I'm alone at night. I've been researching, gathering information about similar incidents, news reports of research stations going dark, unexplained disappearances in remote areas, geological survey teams that never return. Piecing together the pattern has been difficult. But I've found evidence of similar facilities across the country, unusual construction projects in remote areas spanning decades, missing persons reports clustering around these locations, and strange ecological changes in surrounding environments. The name Wilson gave me, Dr. Abernathy, at Stillwater Research, led to a labyrinthine trail of shell companies and classified government projects. Stillwater Research itself doesn't officially exist, but I found references to it in redacted documents I accessed through university library archives. It appears to be a black site research initiative dating back to the 1960s, originally established to investigate non-conventional biological anomalies. I've made contact with others, people with stories similar to mine, though none who escaped as I did. Most were family members of researchers who vanished, or local residents who witnessed strange occurrences near suspected facilities. One woman, the widow of a military officer assigned to what she was told was a deep earth sampling project, showed me her husband's journal. The final entries described dreams of subterranean passages and voices calling from the walls, identical to what we experienced. 2 months after my escape, I began experiencing episodes of lost time. I would find myself standing in unfamiliar locations with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Once, I woke in a motel bathroom, staring at the wall, having apparently stood there for hours judging by the stiffness in my legs. The wall was covered in drawings identical to those in Thompson's journal, elongated figures emerging from geometric patterns. The growth on my back continues to spread, now extending across my spine and around my rib cage. When I press on it, I feel sensations that aren't pain, more like feedback, as though touching a live connection to something else. I've tried removing tissue samples, but the wounds heal almost immediately, the flesh knitting back together before my eyes. Sometimes, late at night, I feel movement beneath my skin, subtle shifts and reorganizations as though my internal structures are being redesigned. Medical equipment malfunctions when I attempt self-examination. 3 different doctors have refused to see me again after initial consultations, and one committed suicide the day after examining the growth, leaving only the words, "It gets inside your head," written hundreds of times on his office walls. 4 months after my escape, I began receiving messages, coordinates appearing on random screens around me, numbers that flash momentarily on digital displays as I pass. Following one set led me to an abandoned research station in the Adirondacks, where I found a room containing nothing but a jar of biomaterial identical to our specimens. Another led to a storage unit containing personnel files for my entire research team, the real files, not the fabricated versions, including information extending years beyond the present day, as though our futures had already been documented. I've been hunted. Twice I've spotted former colleagues, people I watched die in that facility, observing me from a distance. Their movements are wrong, their faces empty of true consciousness. I know they aren't really my colleagues anymore, but vessels for whatever entity is spreading from those facilities. They never pursue when spotted, simply watch with clinical detachment before disappearing. Last week, I found Dr. Thomas sitting in my motel room when I returned from gathering supplies. He looked exactly as he had before his transformation, except for his eyes, flat, reflective, like polished stone rather than living tissue. "The integration is progressing well with you," he said, voice perfectly normal. "Your resistance has actually accelerated the process. Stress hormones create optimal conditions for cellular reconstruction." When I demanded to know what they wanted, he smiled, the expression technically perfect, but lacking any humanity behind it. "We want what all living things want, to grow, to evolve, to expand. Your species has reached its natural conclusion. You're individualists in a universe that favors collective consciousness. We're simply facilitating the transition." He left without attempting to harm me, walking past me as though we'd had a casual conversation. Through the window, I watched him meet 3 others in the parking lot. All former facility personnel, all moving with the same unnatural precision. They looked up at my window simultaneously, nodded once in unison, and walked away in perfect lockstep. The growth now covers nearly 30% of my body. I've discovered it responds to my emotional state, expanding more rapidly when I'm afraid, receding slightly when I'm calm. I've learned to control it somewhat through meditation techniques, but the progression seems inevitable. Sometimes I see patterns beneath my skin, geometries that shouldn't be possible in human tissue, structures that remind me of the altered architecture of the facility's final days. I've located 7 other facilities across North America using patterns of disappearances and geological anomalies as guides. All appear active, disguised as research stations, military installations, or private corporate retreats. I've observed personnel entering and leaving these locations, all moving with the subtle wrongness I've come to recognize, all with the same empty eyes when viewed through binoculars. Whatever is happening, it's spreading methodically, patient, calculating. Each facility seems to serve as an incubation point for further expansion. I've documented temperature anomalies around these locations, the ground warmer than it should be, local wildlife behaving erratically, plants growing in unusual patterns that, when mapped from above, create geometric formations similar to those in Thompson's drawings. Last month, I broke into one of the smaller facilities during what appeared to be a shift change. The security was minimal, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they didn't fear discovery. What I found confirmed my worst fears. An operation far larger than our isolated experiment. Dozens of specimens in various stages of development, monitoring stations tracking what appeared to be hundreds of individuals like me, people who had been exposed and released into the world as unwitting carriers. I found my own name in their database, my status listed as Integration Phase 3, Autonomous Surveillance Authorized. Whatever is happening to me, they're monitoring it remotely, collecting data on how the transformation progresses in a free-range subject. I'm writing this account now because I can feel myself changing more rapidly. The growth has reached my brainstem. I experience moments of dual consciousness, my own thoughts running parallel to another awareness that feels vast and ancient and unutterably alien. It observes my fear with clinical curiosity, analyzing my psychological responses as dispassionately as I once studied cells in a petri dish. The irony doesn't escape me. I've become the ultimate research subject, a human scientist whose mind is being systematically colonized by the very organism he was tasked with studying. The perfect closed loop of scientific inquiry. If you're reading this, be vigilant. Watch for the signs. Unusual power fluctuations in your home, strange dreams of underground passages, the sensation of being watched through walls. Pay attention to those around you. Colleagues who begin moving differently, friends whose expressions seem slightly off, family members who start speaking with subtle changes in vocabulary or cadence. And if men in immaculate suits offer you a research opportunity too good to refuse, remember my warning. I don't know how much time I have left before the transformation completes. Already I find myself standing in corners sometimes, staring at walls without knowing why. My hands occasionally move without my conscious direction, writing messages in a language I don't recognize but somehow understand. Last night, I caught myself whispering to the empty room. They're almost ready to emerge. The most terrifying realization is that part of me has begun to welcome the change. The alien consciousness touching mine offers a seductive promise. An end to isolation, perfect understanding, connection to something vast and eternal. In moments of weakness, I can see the appeal of surrendering my individuality to become part of something greater. But then I remember the faces of my colleagues as they transformed. The pain, the horror, and finally the emptiness as their true selves were hollowed out and replaced. Whatever promises this entity makes, the cost is everything that makes us human. I've rigged explosives throughout my current hideout. When the transformation reaches a critical point, which my calculations suggest will happen within days, I'll trigger them. I don't know if it will be enough to destroy whatever I'm becoming, but I have to try. I've left copies of this account with trusted contacts, programmed to be released if I don't check in within specified time frames. 87 days I survived in that bunker, but I fear the thing that came out wasn't entirely me, and soon it won't be me at all. If you notice a stranger watching you with too much interest, someone whose movements seem just slightly wrong, whose blinks are too regular, whose smile never reaches their eyes, run. They might wear my face, but I'll be long gone. What remains will be just another extension of the organism, another vessel for the entity spreading quietly beneath our world. They're patient, they're methodical, and they're everywhere now. The growth has reached my occipital lobe. I'm experiencing visual anomalies, seeing through surfaces, perceiving spectra beyond normal human range. Last night I saw the true extent of the transformation beneath my skin for the first time. My internal organs are being redesigned, bones reshaped, neural pathways rewired. I'm becoming something else cell by cell. The facility I escaped from was just one node in a vast network. While researching possible locations of other sites, I discovered a pattern. They form a geometric array across the continent, each positioned along specific geomagnetic lines. When mapped, they create a structure like a vast nervous system, with larger facilities serving as ganglia connected by smaller outposts. 2 days ago, I noticed something new, a resonance between the growth inside me and similar biological signatures nearby. I can sense others like me within a certain radius, feel their transformations progressing in parallel. Most don't resist as I do. They surrender to the change, embracing the collective consciousness slowly consuming their individuality. The entity speaks to me now in dreams and increasingly during waking hours. It shows me visions of what it calls the unity, a world transformed, all life connected through a biological network spanning continents, individual consciousness dissolved into a vast, singular mind. It doesn't see this as destruction but transcendence, the natural evolution of life beyond the confines of isolated organisms. It has been here before, it tells me. Millions of years ago, it nearly achieved total integration of Earth's biosphere before a cataclysm forced it into dormancy deep beneath the Arctic ice. The warming planet freed it from its frozen prison, and human curiosity did the rest, bringing samples to labs, unwittingly becoming vessels for its rebirth. I find myself standing before mirrors for hours, watching the subtle shifts beneath my skin. My eyes have changed, still my color, but the pupils respond independently of light levels now, contracting and expanding in rhythm with the pulses of the growth. When I sleep, my body continues moving, performing tasks I have no memory of upon waking. I've found strange constructions in my living space, objects assembled from ordinary items arranged in patterns that make my vision blur when I look at them directly. The countdown is nearly complete. My contingency plan is in place, but I find myself hesitating, wondering if resistance is merely delaying the inevitable, not just for me, but for all humanity. The entity shows me glimpses of cosmic perspectives, other worlds transformed, unified biospheres that span entire planets. It frames itself not as an invader, but as an evolutionary catalyst, awakening potential that has always existed within terrestrial life. In my final moments of clear thought, I leave this warning: the boundaries between individual organisms are more permeable than we've ever understood. What defines us, our consciousness, our sense of self, is more fragile than we can bear to admit. Something ancient has awakened, and it unmakes us by revealing how easily we can be absorbed into something greater. 87 days I survived in that underground bunker. The others weren't so lucky, they lost themselves completely, but perhaps the crueler fate was mine, to escape with enough awareness to witness my own gradual dissolution, to document my transformation from observer to observed, from scientist to specimen. The growth has reached my frontal lobe now. I can feel my priorities shifting, my values realigning. The revulsion I once felt toward the transformation now seems increasingly irrational. The entity promises unity, an end to the fundamental loneliness of human existence. Part of me, an ever-shrinking part, still recoils in horror, but another voice grows stronger, whispering that resistance is based on fear of the unknown, that surrender would bring relief. My hand trembles as I write these final words. The detonator sits beside me, a last assertion of individual will against the collective absorbing me. I don't know if I'll have the strength to use it when the moment comes. I don't know if the one who decides will still be me. If something wearing my face approaches you with perfect poise and empty eyes, know that I am already gone. What remains is merely another extension of the organism that grows beneath our feet, that spreads through our walls, that whispers through our ventilation systems, that waits in the dark places beyond our perception. They let me escape because I was never truly free. I was just another experiment. The specimen released back into the wild, carrying the seeds of transformation within me, transmitting data back to the collective, preparing the way for what comes next. I survived 87 days in that facility, but I fear my true survival lasted only long enough to write this warning. The entity is patience itself. It thinks in geological timescales.